Secrecy is something like forbidden fruit. You can't have it. It's classified. That makes you want it more. If somebody discloses that we listen to a cell phone that Osama bin Laden is using to talk to his Zawahiri, who's in Peshawar, Pakistan, this fact would do damage to the national security, so it has to be kept classified.
The conclusion of the congressional inquiry in 9/11 said, we were fighting the war on terror as a country without our most powerful weapon, which was an alert and informed American public. The secrecy prevents the alert. The secrecy prevents informed action. The secrecy prevents democratic deliberation. The secrecy prevents effective counterterrorism. To fight terrorism, we need to know. Like the passengers on Flight 93, we need to know.
Should Americans be involved in operations to kidnap foreign people, and should they make them disappear? And is that consistent with who we are as a nation? I would argue that that is exactly the kind of thing that we would want our intelligence services to be doing, because what we want is to wage that clandestine war. Take it under the radar, so our enemy does not see us coming. And so we have more latitude of action. And we can use methods that are not necessarily consistent with the values of Americans.
No one knew where Khalid al-Masri was until he was released at the end of his ordeal. There was no one to fight for Khalid al-Masri. Even his family didn't know where he was. His wife thought she had been abandoned. Khalid al-Masri is a German citizen who was born in Lebanon. He got on a bus from his hometown of Ulm, Germany, to travel to Macedonia. And when he got to Macedonia, he was pulled off the bus by officials. He was turned over to the local CIA agents on the ground, who blindfolded him, brought him to an airport, sliced off his clothes, forced an object into his anus, injected him with drugs, chained him to the floor of a plane, and flew him to Afghanistan, a country where he had never been and with which he had absolutely no contact. Al-Masri was brought to a facility that we believe is called the Salt Pit, a former brick factory on the outskirts of Kabul. And there he was held in a dungeon for nearly 5 months, even though the CIA and high officials of the US government knew well before then that they had detained the wrong person. The very purpose of setting up these black sites was to allow the CIA to hold people and to interrogate them using methods that would not be permitted under US and international law. Khalid al-Masri was told, "You are in a place right now whose existence no one knows. You are off the map of civilization. Unless you cooperate with us in every way, anything can happen to you. No one would know."
There is a need for secrecy in order to protect the national security of the United States. The public is told by the media that there's excessive secrecy in government. The media is always trying to reduce the level of secrecy. They're always trying to get information that the intelligence community thinks should be protected.
The rubble of the bombed-out U.S. Embassy in Beirut is giving up more victims. The confirmed death toll from yesterday's explosion stands tonight at 24, 8 of them Americans.
In Lebanon, in 1983. Terrorists attacked the American embassy and caused a lot of damage and some deaths. We at NSA were listening to the communications of the people that did it, and we knew who they were and what country was supporting them. It was Iran supporting them through the Hezbollah. This fact was leaked.
Those cables were intercepted by American intelligence prior to the
bombing. It got into the press somehow, I don't know how, and almost immediately that communication channel that we were using so productively to derive intelligence on the whereabouts of these terrorists, that channel dried up. We lost a critical source of intelligence. Eight months later, the same terrorists bombed the Marine barracks in Beirut, and we lost over 240 United States Marines. This is the kind of damage that can come from a leak of sensitive information. We have a special word for people who provide information to the enemy of their country.
What word is that?
What word do we use? Traitor. Traitor.
I really resent accusations that we're not patriots or that we are indifferent to the security of the United States if we publish things that the government says are secret. I think what I do is every bit as patriotic as what a soldier does or what an intelligence officer does. I think that people who look only at security are misjudging what kind of society they're supposed to be defending. And I think ultimately the idea that the president and the president alone can decide what we will know is profoundly un-American. I went to Iraq for the first time a few days after the fall of Baghdad, covering weapons of mass destruction. And I timed my trip for the purpose of arriving for the first of the big finds of chemical weapons. What I was trying to find out was, what was the truth of it? Did Iraq still have programs? Did it have stored munitions? Had it reconstituted its nuclear weapons program? All those things were alleged by the Bush administration. And one by one, those things fell apart. And at every step of the way, the fact that they were falling apart was protected by government secrecy. The same weeks I was writing these stories in 2003, senior officials were holding briefings in Washington.
As I said earlier, we have high confidence that they have weapons of mass destruction. That is what this war was about and is about. And we have high confidence it will be found.
And what I was discovering on the ground was that they had already exploited, as they call it, 89 of the top 90 sites. They had found nothing that they were expecting to find, that the weapons teams were dispirited, having declared failure. And absent someone who was going to pierce that secrecy and report what was actually happening on the ground, the official account was going to be the only thing out there, was going to stand as truth in the public record. And it was not true.
I'm not sure that I'm in a position to know whether the current world situation demands more secrecy or less. I know that for an entire couple of generations, we actually lived in a comfort zone of the Cold War. And it provided a comfort zone because it had parameters. And we have lost that. We have so much information being created, it's hard to imagine that humanly it could be controlled. There are, within these billions of pages, many thousands, perhaps millions, that will help rewrite history in some way. As secrecy disappears over time, we gain a clearer picture of what actually happened over the course of time. Sometimes it can be very dramatic. More often it's more subtle, but subtleties that may change our way of thinking.
It wasn't a top secret mission, and it evidently never had been a top secret mission. But they were presenting it to the Supreme Court as just that, and too important in its day to have been opened up for even the Supreme Court's viewing. It was 1946, and I was 18 years old. This friend of my mother's had said, "Oh, this young man is so wonderful. Patty has to meet this young man." For 3 weeks, I put it off. Whoever he was, I didn't want to meet him. And then I met Bob Reynolds. That changed things. We met about the 1st of September, and were married November 30th. Very fast. This was love at first sight. It was a very romantic relationship, and it stayed that way right to his death.
On October 6, 1948, at about 2 in the afternoon, a B-29 fell 20,000 feet to crash outside of Waycross, Georgia. 9 people were killed, including 3 civilian engineers who were on board testing some electronic equipment. Albert Palya, William Brawner, and Robert Reynolds. In early 1949, the widows began looking for legal counsel and ended up finding Drinker, Biddle, and Reith in Philadelphia. They had very little information other than there was a violent spiral, an engine fire, and an explosion that broke the plane up 10,000 feet above the ground. Something went wrong. Was it negligence? The widows needed proof, but the government refused to produce its accident report, saying that the disclosure of these documents would be harmful to national security because the plane was on a secret mission and it was carrying confidential equipment. The judge has issued an order saying you will produce the documents to me for the limited purpose of assessing whether or not what the Air Force is saying about the documents is true. The government petitions the Supreme Court to review the case, saying, we're the executive, we need this power. The lower courts aren't giving it to us, but it's time for the Supreme Court to weigh in.
I've been studying the secrecy system really from its gestation. Voluntary self-censorship by the nuclear physicist immediately prior to the Manhattan Project, aware of the possibilities of what a nuclear bomb might be, and not interested in giving anybody else a heads up. Then, at the point of the huge investment by the federal government in the Manhattan Project, that was the point of the actual creation of the modern secrecy system. World War II, and particularly the Manhattan Project, was the beginning.
What they were concerned about was that the Germans would win in the race to the bomb. Use this enormous explosive power to win the Second World War and to rule the world. It was exceedingly important to compartmentalize, to limit the number of people who have access to that information. Even the physics calculations that led to how much material, how fast would you need to assemble, what isotopic purity would you need in your materials? Machining techniques, assembly techniques, whether you press, form, heat, cool, they were all part of the important secret. This was considered such a big secret that Vice President Truman didn't find out about the project until he became President of the United States.
Years later, General Groves, the head of the Manhattan Project, was trying to explain why we needed so much secrecy on the Manhattan Project. And he gave a series of reasons why we needed to keep secret everything having to do with the nuclear bomb. Number one reason for the secrecy was the Germans. Number two reason for the secrecy was the Japanese. Number three reason for the secrecy was the Russians, our allies, but looking forward to a nice new war. Number four reason for the secrecy was all other countries, so we can keep a monopoly. Number five reason for the secrecy was other executive agencies and the Congress who might interfere in the program. Truth is told by bureaucrats. A core motivation of the secrecy is about control and power.
Here it is, General Groves, plutonium.
That secrecy system boomed.
Now you could do with one bomb what it took an enormous military to do before. It was a quantum jump in the capabilities of mankind. Because of that, secrecy was that much more important.
The commission that investigated the September 11 attacks found that secrecy had actually impeded the functioning of our national security. The Central Intelligence Agency and the National Security Agency possessed information about the 9/11 hijackers, but it was classified at so high a level that it was never shared with FBI agents in the field. It's kind of the reduction to the absurd of what the classification system is supposed to be. Instead of protecting national security, it actually facilitated a threat to national security.
The 9/11 Commission findings said the U.S. intelligence community failed to connect the dots. And a key point that the 9/11 Commission failed to grasp was that there were too few good dots. When the United States was attacked by Japan on December 7th, 1941, we look back on that and say that was an intelligence failure. Army intelligence had some information that might have prevented that attack. Navy intelligence had some information that might have prevented an attack. That information wasn't shared very well. As a result, we were attacked. After the war, Congress concluded that what we needed was some central mechanism to collate and fuse all that intelligence. That central mechanism was the Central Intelligence Agency. This country needed a warning capability. It needed to have a mechanism to warn against threats and to warn against surprise attack. In 1998, there was press coverage in several newspapers that we had an intercept capability of Osama bin Laden's satellite telephone communications. When that press coverage exposed that intelligence collection capability to no one's surprise, except perhaps of the press, we lost the ability to monitor those satellite communications of Osama bin Laden. What I can tell you is that that's only the tip of the iceberg. Intelligence collection capabilities require secret mechanisms that we know, if exposed, will be less effective, and in some cases, if exposed, will perish completely. We lost one very valuable and potentially lucrative source of intelligence on what turned out to be the most horrific attack on the United States in history. What a shame it is that we did not have this capability. The only reason we did not have this capability was because of a pointless and needless press disclosure. And the question for the American citizen is, was that in my interest? Was that in my interest as a citizen to have the press expose these capabilities?
I was in Langley on 9/11. And as those attacks unfolded, because I was a counterterrorism officer, and because I had worked against Osama bin Laden, I had a very large knowledge base on this particular threat. So as the attacks were unfolding, I saw the first tower go down, the plane go into the tower, and I remember thinking quite clearly that this was Osama bin Laden, that we've been struck again, that we have failed the nation. As I drove home, huge traffic jams. I was thinking forward very much at the time of, well, now's the time that you need to get back into the real fight. Because the gloves were going to come off. There was no question at that point in time. When you're attacked at home, the rules change.
I was down very close to the towers when the second one collapsed. I looked down at my notebook and I knew I was supposed to write something because that's what I do, and I just wrote, "gone." And words failed for a while. But soon after that, we realized that We were in a new world and a new situation, and we had to delve into it. One of the things that we asked ourselves at the Washington Post very early on is, if this is going to be a new kind of war, what's new about it exactly? And we'd better be trying to keep a close eye on what sort of changes are wrought on the country.
Post 9/11, a veil of secrecy has descended upon much of the government. We're seeing information that had been on thousands of government and military websites taken behind a firewall. Unimaginable quantities of government information that had been available no longer are. And because we don't see them, we don't miss them. Of government secrecy is almost unimaginably large. It includes billions of pages of historical documents, millions of new secrets generated each year, tens of thousands of new secrets every day of the year. The financial cost of secrecy grew by $1 billion to an unprecedented $7.5 billion in a single year. That's the size of a budget of a cabinet-level government agency. It's as if we had a Department of Government Secrecy that no one has ever heard of.
Secrets are seductive in two directions. There's a seduction of secrecy for the securocrats, because that is the key tool they use to gain and keep and regulate power. And it's extremely seductive even when they know better, because it's easy. It's reflexive, and it's within their power. So there's a mirror image of that on the other side. To get the release of a secret means a reduction in official power. All by itself, that's an interesting and, to my mind, core American value. The entire constitutional framework, as I understand it, is set up to restrain power. So the release of secrecy somehow is just an all-American kind of thing. And there's the titillation aspect of it. Because here's an arena the government has worked very hard to shroud. And it's not like we're, Anthony Perkins pulling back the shower curtain on Janet Leigh, because we're not. We're more like the little mouse crawling up to pull the shower curtain against the size of what the national security bureaucracy is. But there's a thrill to it. There's a voyeurism to secrecy, which has sexual connotations because you're looking into the unknown, you're looking in the taboo. What was it that your parents really did at night that created other kids? What is it that the national security state does at night to wage wars?
In November 2001, Salam Hamdan was fleeing the Afghanistan border and trying to cross over into Pakistan. He was captured by Northern Alliance forces who heard his story and then used that story to sell him to the Americans for a hefty fee. The Americans ultimately brought him to Guantanamo Bay, because he had admitted being Osama bin Laden's personal driver. He knew bin Laden, unlike most of the other people at Guantanamo. It was definitely a really low-level, small fry guy, but at least the administration could say, well, we got people related to the bad guys there. President Bush, on November 13, 2001, issued a military order for the trial of suspected terrorists at Guantanamo Bay. He was going to set up the entire trial system on his own. Who could be tried, how they could be tried. He was going to pick the judges, hand-pick the prosecutors and defense attorneys, and he went so far in that order as to say that the federal courts have no business reviewing what he's doing because of the classified national security information that might be at stake. The prosecutor appointed Lieutenant Commander Charles Swift of the Navy to be Mr. Hamdan's counsel.
You would think I'm going to see somebody who's the combination of Al Capone, Adolf Hitler, and Genghis Khan. I mean, now this guy is just, oh my God. He could bring America to his knees with a pencil. Dangerous. When I get in, the first thing that they say is, well, you have to take off your name tag. I'm wearing a name tag on the uniform. Now, why? Well, he can't know who you are. Now, wait a second, guys. I don't defend people by saying, you don't know who I am, but I'm going to defend you. Now, why don't we all have a little courage, and I'll tell him who I am. After all, I'm the one who's going down. No, the rules are. And then, well, I'm not going to take it off. What are you going to do? And here he is. He doesn't move when he first sees me, but that's because he has a set of handcuffs on that chain his hands absolutely together to his feet, so he's kind of hunched over and he can't move. Ultimately, I'm able to get the handcuffs off of him. So at least now, and a little bit of chain so he can stand so that I can shake. So I go to shake his hand. Don't touch him. What is he, a bear? Come on. He's not an animal. He's not a bear. I'm going to shake my client's hand. Thank you. Solemn looks at me. Solemn says, the guards say there's no law here. How can you do anything? There's no law. I said, I don't believe that. I don't believe they're right. I believe there's law everywhere. But we're going to have to go to the Supreme Court of the United States and win if that's to be true.
We first heard about Khalid al-Masri's nightmare ordeal the way most of the world first heard about it. We read an article in the newspaper that had these fantastic allegations of an innocent man being kidnapped by the CIA and subjected to torture in a secret prison. It seemed really beyond belief. The ACLU representing Khalid al-Masri brought a lawsuit, but before Tenet and the other defendants even answered the lawsuit in federal court, the CIA came into federal court and in a secret affidavit explained that the case had to be dismissed because any litigation of the claim would involve state secrets and would harm national security. The state secrets privilege was really born in sin. The whole doctrine is the fruit of a poisonous tree. It was first recognized in the United States in a case called Reynolds, involving the crash of an Air Force plane.
The B-29 blew up in the air. My father was 41 when he died. As a child, I have very vivid memories of going up into our attic. There were a couple boxes of pictures of him. Among those were engineering manuals for the project he worked on during World War II. It was really intriguing to look through the books, even though I had no clue as to what they were talking about. because every page at the bottom was stamped secret. In the newspaper articles after the plane crashed, all of them talk about this top secret project. It just added to the mystery, you know, of who my father was.
It was so murky back in the 50s. Those were troubling times. The Cold War threatened to ignite at any moment. We had so many things to fear.
The Reynolds case comes to the Supreme Court in 1952. And we're at a time in our history when we are scared. We had the awesome technology, and now through spies, our enemies have that technology. It's a very scary, scary time. Everyone agrees there should be a state secret privilege. The issue is, who's going to police that privilege? When the government says, this is a state secret, what steps are we going to have in place to assure that that's so? What role would the judiciary play? And the Supreme Court's answer to that, 6-3, was not much.
The Supreme Court said, we agree with the United States. There must be a privilege for state secrets. And the Supreme Court made a very critical error. It did not even look at the document that the government insisted contained secret information.
The Air Force pled secrecy being imperative to the safety of the country. And ultimately, the Supreme Court accepted it, and so did we. At least so did I. Not dreaming that there was anything other than what appeared on the surface, that there were governmental secrets that at that time could not be exposed.
And the books close on that case at that point. It's the fall of 1953. That's the last of the Reynolds case for 50 years.
I joined the CIA during the Cold War. In the intelligence community, it was actually a very simple war. You knew who your enemy was, and you knew what your enemy wanted.
Today in the national security establishment is a ideological, one almost might say culture war happening between folks I would identify as the Cold Warriors, who believe in compartmented information and the need to know and high controls and more secrecy and more classification, versus the people who are self-described as the web crawlers, the people who understand that distributed information networks actually empower. This war is being won by the Cold Warriors, unfortunately. And you can look at the 9/11 Commission report, and it's on its face an indictment of the Cold War approach to information control. The assumption that somewhere in the bureaucracy there are people who can decide that other people have a need to know or not. And that's the controlling theory of how they've constructed this secrecy system, the need to know. As if anyone could be so omniscient.
You're an analyst. Let's say you're a Somali analyst, and you got a little bit of chaos going on in Somalia, and you're trying to figure out what it is. You are only going to have access to certain kinds of information. Our compartmentalization process was set up prior to computerization, all right? So when we built our computers, we built them on the existing models of how we manually processed information. So when our Somali analyst is trying to figure out these warlords, what they're doing, they're meeting with people that have come from Chechnya or from Bosnia or from Afghanistan. Gee, they're Islamicists. That's all very interesting, but you don't have a need to know about that as the Somali analyst. So you can't even ask the question to get the intelligence back. All of a sudden, you have a group that have the capability to take down U.S. military helicopters. You're not going to have that data point to be able to answer the question of why is it that they have this capability today and they didn't have it a year ago. In that specific case, it's because Osama bin Laden had organized Islamic fighters to move into Somalia and to train the warlords. They were entering the jihad movement, and yet that Somali analyst never had access to that intelligence.
The classification system really is an industrial age kind of information policy. But we're not in the industrial age anymore. We're in the information age, and information flows differently. When you try to regulate information flow rigidly by deciding that a certain piece of information can go to this person but not to that person, you pay a price. You lose the effects of serendipity, the unanticipated contribution that someone on the network can make.
How do you completely redo information management to allow people to have free-flowing access and still keep secrecy at the same time? We're not close to answering that yet because we still haven't got away from the idea, the fundamental idea, that we need to protect the information from ourselves.
It takes me about 30 hours to get down to Guantanamo Bay. Each time it involves me waking up in the middle of the night, driving for 4 hours, flying for approximately 15 hours through a convoluted route, begging my way onto a military base where they can't really understand why I'm there. I don't fit their two boxes of either being an officer or a contractor. I'm that third box, the guy who's suing the Secretary of Defense. Now, anyone who's studied the Anglo-American criminal justice system knows that the one thing you cannot do, the most basic foundational thing, is kick someone out of their own criminal trial. What President Bush's order set out to do was permit defendants, in the name of protecting secrets, to be kicked out of their own trials, to be literally put to death on the basis of information that they never got to see.
If you're to the point that you can be the executioner without telling anyone about it and not having anyone look at it and being able to do all that in secret, what's left? What's left? If I can decide the reasons you will be held in jail for the rest of your life, and I alone get to know them, and I don't have to tell anyone, what's left? When laid bare, their argument is there is no limit on presidential power. The president ultimately decides his power, and no one else. Yet fundamentally, that was what they had claimed for the commissions. Fundamentally, that was what they had claimed for interrogations, for wiretapping, all of these things, and done it in secrecy. But the Hamdan case had the opportunity to begin to pull back the blanket of that bare, raw assertion of power.
The dichotomy is not between national security and openness. The dichotomy is between secrecy and security. The secrecy is not making us safer. There are better ways to make us safer. Less secrecy would actually make us safer. We caught the Unabomber because we published his screeds in the newspaper, and his brother opened the Chicago Tribune in the suburbs of Illinois and said, this sounds like Crazy Ted up at cabin in Montana, better call the FBI, and they go catch him. 12 years they chased this guy. Never caught him until they turned loose the stuff they'd been sitting on. Publicity generated the means to connect the dots, and the secrecy prevented the safety.
The four freedoms that we have are very vital to American society. They're very important. Free press is a great thing to have. We want to keep it. But we who are trying to protect sensitive national security information have a responsibility to the people to protect this information on their behalf.
If you published only what they willingly told you, you wouldn't know that Osama bin Laden escaped from Tora Bora. You wouldn't know that people are being seized on the street in foreign countries and taken secretly to prisons elsewhere in the world without any judicial process. You wouldn't know that the U.S. government is employing methods against detainees that it has previously described as torture. You wouldn't know many of the basic outlines of what the government is doing in the name of the war on terror. And yet, the president said this should be the issue on which you decide the election.
Journalists, in my opinion, treat secrecy as a game. It is their game to expose the secrets, because then they have a story. CIA doesn't look at secrecy as a game. They look at it as a survival mechanism. The consequences in some countries for agents who have been caught for betraying their country is death. Terrorists don't have any problem with taking out a CIA officer. Some terrorists wouldn't think twice of taking out your family as well.
Information is power. Information has potency. Some information, in fact, is so potent that it could be dangerous. God created the universe with speech. Some speech is so powerful, its creative power or its destructive power is almost boundless. The act of concealment and revelation is a primordial gesture. In biblical terms, the first thing Adam and Eve did after eating from the tree of knowledge was to cover their nakedness. The overcoming of concealment, the act of revelation, has a profound resonance in the psychology of the secret keepers and those who challenge them.
When I told my mother what I did for a living over the past decades, I mean, I thought she was going to have a heart attack. And after that, then I was afraid that she would stop. You know, she could ask me 300 questions. Well, was this guy a spy? Was this guy a spy? What were you doing in this country at that time? I mean, all these questions and things that she wanted to know. So I opened up this Pandora's box. There was a whole part of my life that I really, you know, robbed my circle of friends and family from enjoying because it was a clandestine journey for me. My husband and I, we had a secret wedding. Who has secret weddings? We had to because we had to get our security clearances in time. So you tell people, oh, well, that wedding that you really attended, it wasn't really the wedding, and Dad, by the way, you paid for a sham wedding. You hope that people can laugh and joke about it, but at the end of the day, you realize that there's been a betrayal in a relationship, and those things do add up over time.
Moscow, 1992. The opening exhibit of the Soviet archives unveiled. People are standing in line around the block, and I'm standing in line too. We're heading up toward the top of the staircase, and all of a sudden a huge ruckus, and a guy comes down on a stretcher being carried by guards, a very old pensioner wearing the old gray Soviet overcoat with his medals from the Great Patriotic War right by his lapel. And he's gray-haired and gray-bearded and gaunt and old, and the TV cameras are aiming down on him as he's coming down the stairs, and they're asking questions. Well, what happened? What happened? And the guy said, well, I knew that Stalin and Molotov had signed that deal with Hitler and Ribbentrop. But right up there, they had it, and I could actually see it, and I passed out. It's kind of the power of the artifact in its reality. The artifact can lie, and the artifact sure doesn't have the whole truth in it, but it has a weird kind of authenticity to it that has its own power. My mother died when I was really little. One of the ways that I learned who she was by reading the marginalia she wrote in the books that she read. I read Dante's Inferno not for the text, but for her notes in the side, because I was trying to find out who she was.
In early 2000, Judy Lothar, the daughter of Albert Palya, who was killed in this crash, was surfing the internet. And a website comes up which identifies all sorts of accident reports. And Judy's very excited because she's going to get some information about her dad. When her dad died, she was 6 weeks old. She never knew him.
I went to the mailbox, and it was this big manila envelope. I remember going into my family room and sitting down on the sofa, just contemplating what was in there. So do I really want to see gory details in there about how he died? So I opened it. It was kind of overwhelming to look at that report and try and digest all the mistakes that had been made by so many people that ended up killing 9 men. And I realized there was another woman out there that maybe would benefit by what I had found.
When I received the accident report and read it over, it was truly devastating. There had been many problems with the heat rings. They had been advised by the Air Force not to fly until those heat rings were all replaced. And on this plane, none of that was done. And the more I read, the worse I felt. And of course, you've got all of these shots showing this mangled wreckage and the smoke coming out. And the thought that hits you, of course, is Bob was in that. You've got to remember that when I had seen Bob leave the day of the crash, he was a young, vibrant 24-year-old. We were about to embark on a new phase of our lives in our new apartment, and everything was going to be wonderful for 100 years. And I never saw him again. It was always in the back of my mind, I know he's gone, but. And for some reason, reading this report, brought it to reality.
There's no mention in there of the project these people were involved in. There's no mention in there of the equipment that they were carrying. There's no mention in there of what they were trying to accomplish on this flight. The accident report describes an horrific accident and expressly finds negligence on the part of the U.S. Air Force. They hadn't done what they were supposed to do. That's not a secret.
There's one line about secret testing of electronic equipment, and that's what it says. The mission was to test some secret electronic equipment, period. Wouldn't tell the enemy anything. And yet the government entered affidavits sufficient to have the Supreme Court throw the widows out.
Men in power in my America decided to lie in the Supreme Court. They wanted the state secrets precedent. And we were the sacrifice. That's the way I see it. It was the widows and the children were the sacrifice so that the government could get their precedent.
And that case has been cited 600 times based on a falsehood.
The state secrets privilege was established with a lie and has allowed the government to tell the same kinds of lies over and over again. But what's so striking about the way the state secrets privilege is being used now is that the government is using the state secrets privilege as an immunity doctrine. And so it's not waiting until a plaintiff asks for information. It's coming in as soon as the case is filed and saying effectively, this case cannot be adjudicated. And so we have this really amazing situation where the perpetrators themselves, the people who are being accused of illegal and unconstitutional conduct, are themselves coming into court and saying, nothing to look at here, everything is secret, if this case goes forward, it will harm national security. And by virtue of those statements alone, without any examination of purportedly secret evidence, some of the most significant cases in U.S. judicial history are being dismissed at the outset. Reynolds should be evidence enough that the state secrets privilege is prone to abuse. But for those who were unpersuaded by Reynolds, Khalid El-Masri's case is the Reynolds case of the last decade.
If you don't ever have to answer for what you've done, if you don't have to explain to a neutral fact finder at any point, you can make a series of judgments that are absolutely wrong. In the dark, you can get as lost as the people you're trying to hide things from.
The first report to expose the abuse of prisoners in U.S. custody in the Iraq War was actually classified secret. Now, according to the rules, the classification system cannot be used to conceal criminal activity. And yet, in this case, it was.
Secrecy was the essential shroud for changing the rules of the game. If there hadn't been secrecy on these memos coming down from the White House and from Rumsfeld and from these lawyers at Justice Department, they couldn't have done it. Even after 9/11, there are lines over which you don't go, even in self-defense. So the secrecy enabled a kind of takeover of legal precedent and of rule. War is brutal and bloody and the worst instincts of humankind. And the struggle of civilization and war for centuries has been, how do you bring war into the ambit of morality? You don't kill civilians. There are rules for how you treat prisoners. You don't use WMD. Now, we as a country have broken those rules, but at our peril, because those rules fundamentally protect us more than they protect anybody else. And yet, in the context of the signals from on high saying the gloves are off, in the context of the whole apparatus shrouded by secrecy, and in the context of war, all of a sudden the gloves really do come off, and the hoods go on, and the electrodes go on, and the leashes go on.
Unlike most Americans, when I look at Abu Ghraib, I'm horrified for completely different reasons. I think most Americans are just horrified at the obscenity of the visuals of torture, the reality of what was going on in that prison. I, too, am horrified by that, but I'm horrified that Americans were torturing Iraqis for no intelligence purpose. And to me, that is a professional crime. As a person who's had an awful lot of experience of sitting down with people who don't want really to cooperate and having to create an environment, a framework in which they're going to tell you what you need to know. You need them to tell you the truth. You're not going to get that from them by torturing. If you're going to do your job right, you're not going to create Abu Ghraibs. Maybe it's not going to be pretty in the sense that Americans are going to say, this is consistent with our ideals as an American. I think that you'll always have those tensions. You need to keep your enemy confused and outside the knowledge loop of how you're operating against them. You don't want them to know where they are. You want them to be insecure. You want them to fear what's going to happen next, to be able to extract that intelligence and use that in order to win. If they know your game, and they know your strategy, and they know your tactics, you have so handicapped yourself that you will not win. And right now, we need to be winning.
What's fascinating to me about the techniques they used at Abu Ghraib are they the very same techniques that we saw in Central America in the 1980s by our proxies, by the South Vietnamese and their tiger cages in Vietnam in the 1960s. They are universals. They're probably some of the same techniques minus the modern mechanics that Nebuchadnezzar used on his captives in the Iraqi desert a couple millennia ago, because there's a deep well of evil in the human soul, and you dip back into it in extreme conditions, and what the secrecy allowed was them to dip, and they pulled out the same old stuff. got the torture manuals released that the CIA was using in Vietnam. Most of them got burned, but a few copies got saved in the 1970s when this all got exposed and the tiger cages got blown. Now they're back in the 1980s, and oh my God, an existential threat again. Those communists are on their way to Harlingen, Texas. They're going to threaten our very being, our American fabric. We've got to dip back into the well or go to the back of the file cabinet. Ooh, let's find that old manual. Aha, here's one. Here's how you do it. You neutralize the people like school teachers or nurses who might deliver something that people would value in the Nicaraguan countryside. Neutralize. Don't use the word assassinate. Don't use the word murder, but everybody knows what you're talking about. It's part of the dark well at the heart of the human soul. You dip back in. Oh, we clean up our act in the 90s, the decade of the openness. We're spreading human rights and rule of law all over the world. Democratization. This is great. Boom, they attacked the World Trade Center. Hey, gloves are off. Let's go to the back of the file cabinet, except now it's the back of the hard disk. Let's find that little tidbit. How do you do this? Same piece comes back because the secrecy allows us to dip.
In the mid-1990s, the world looked safer. But that was only because we had blinders on. We weren't then really spinning out the scenarios of transnational terrorist networks. Today, when you take a look at our threat environment, we face the very real potential that a terrorist organization will obtain the capability and will try to implement a WMD attack against a major city in the world.
The Cold War was a high-tech war. We were constantly looking to out-invent and out-create the Russians, to stay one step ahead of them. Now, all of a sudden, in nuclear terrorism, it's the more primitive information related to nuclear weapons. That's very important. And so how do we keep that appropriately secret, or can we anymore today? The essential information as to how to make those bombs is out there. You can Google for it. A single bomb in New York City or in Moscow or in Berlin would have just enormous destructive capability. Tens to hundreds of thousands of people killed instantly. The effects of radiation, devastation of an entire city.
And that will have phenomenal impact on the way we Americans live our lives. You cannot have a bomb, a dirty bomb, go off in London and think that America's not going to be impacted. Americans will no longer feel that they have the luxury to be an open and free society. A democracy is not a natural state of being. Democracy requires a shared belief system. A democracy requires a citizenry that is committed to certain rules of the game. And if we begin to redefine those rules because of fear of terrorists, democracy could very well be a casualty of that.
hear argument in number 05184, Hamdan against Rumsfeld. Mr. Cadiel, you may proceed.
Justice Stevens, may it please the Court, we ask this Court to preserve the status quo, to require that the President respect time-honored limitations on military commissions. When I walked into the Supreme Court that morning, I was overwhelmed by the majesty of the court, the nation's highest court, hearing a challenge by a man who is accused of conspiring with one of the world's most evil men and suing the President of the United States, the world's most powerful man.
The gravity of the moment literally took your breath away. The importance of what we were talking about was both thrilling and terrifying. We can't lose this. It's not enough to have said I tried. It's just not enough. We have to win.
I have the disposition to announce in number 05184, Hamdan against Rumsfeld.
The day the decision came down, I was sitting in the courtroom with Commander Swift at my side. Justice Stevens started reading the opinion.
We decide, in effect, that Congress has denied the President the legislative authority to create this military commission. Nothing prevents the President from returning to Congress to seek the authority he believes necessary, and no emergency stands in the way of such.
I kept on going through the 20 or so issues in the case and thinking, check, he ruled on that one for us, and check, he ruled on this one for us, and ultimately I saw we'd won everything.
As I walked out of the court on the last day, out onto the steps with Neil, what I felt most was relieved. Absolutely relieved. We had not blown it. And it is an amazing day. That afternoon, the White House is announcing, well, we'll just change the law. So the challenge continues.
If the President is taking secret actions that violate laws passed by Congress, treaties ratified by the Senate, and doing it in the name of executive power, well, one might think that's permitted on September 15th, 2001, but years later it is a fundamentally corrosive threat to democracy.
Nuclear capable or bioweapons capable or chemical weapons capable terrorist threat. This in many ways is a kind of threat that can be battled to a large degree under the veil of secrecy, and I think it should be. How do you keep in equilibrium the secret world and our open society? And I think sometimes when you're facing a threat such as we are facing, there has to be a little bit of give. We need to empower our intelligence services to go out and do some of that dirty work so that we can remove these threats.
We need some secrecy because we all have secrets, because there are some real secrets that would make the world a lot more dangerous. And most of us, if we saw those real secrets from common sense, would recognize them and would want them protected. All one has to say is, how to design a binary chemical warhead? If Gaddafi had known how to do that, he might not be disarming today, and we might be in a lot more trouble in the Middle East. There are real secrets. The challenge is, not only are there real secrets, there are these overwhelming tendencies within the bureaucracy to control turf and to aggrandize power. Overwhelming tendencies today in the presidency. Major economic interests, major turf and bureaucratic interests that are pushing greater secrecy, and there's no countervailing power.
When things are secret, we don't have to be responsible. We can live our lives without taking on the responsibility of our country. Democracy begins with this very simple idea. It's all of us. We're all responsible. We get the country we deserve because we chose it. A great nation's character is what makes it great. And our character was formed on the idea of a society devoted to the rule of law. And that is powerful. When you are afraid, it's hard to have character. Fear coursing through your veins makes it tough. When you get down to it, courage is the ability to follow your principles even when you're scared to death.